Thales, a story of young Pythagoras. The tapestry of young Pythagoras's life, already rich with the threads of esoteric learning and profound encounters, was destined for yet more vibrant hues and intricate patterns before the boy truly became the master. The years following his emergence from the hallowed, shadowy belly of Eleusis were a crucible, forging his burgeoning manhood and shaping his resolve, leading him to the sun-scorched plains of Olympia, where one final, incandescent spark would set his ultimate course. Part 1. The Interlude. Echoes of Eleusis and the Loom of Mortal Life. Emerging from the Telesterian's sacred darkness, Pythagoras carried within him not a set of doctrines, but an altered state of being. The world, once a complex geometric puzzle to be solved, now pulsed with an interconnected aliveness, a symphony of hidden correspondences that resonated with the truths he had experienced in Demeter's embrace. For nearly 2 transformative years, he, Nicarchus, and Pythes made their dwelling in a quiet hamlet nestled in the undulating hills of Attica, a stone's throw from the Eleusinian sanctuary, allowing the profound echoes of the mysteries to settle and integrate into the very marrow of his soul. He was now a youth of some 16 summers, lean and thoughtful, his eyes holding a depth that belied his age, a quiet gravity replacing the restless curiosity of his earlier years. The hamlet itself seemed touched by the sacred proximity to Eleusis. Ancient olive trees, their trunks gnarled with centuries of wisdom, cast dancing shadows over stone-paved paths where purple thyme grew wild between the cracks. The local well, fed by a spring that some claimed originated from the same underground waters that blessed the sanctuary, provided a constant, gentle music of flowing water that seemed to echo the rhythmic chants Pythagoras still heard in his dreams. Here, in this liminal space between the sacred and the mundane, he learned to walk once more in the world of mortals while carrying the ineffable treasures of initiation. Nicarchus, whose gnarled hands coaxed forth beauty from stubborn gemstones, understood that even a spirit bathed in the light of the mysteries required roots in the fertile soil of the everyday. With patient wisdom, he guided Pythagoras through the practical arts of manhood. They would visit the bustling Piraeus, where the salt-scented air carried the dreams and ambitions of a dozen nations. Here Nicarchus taught him to discern the quality of raw materials, the uncut stones from distant lands that whispered of mountain depths and hidden fire, the fine woods that bore the memory of forests, the metals that carry the earth's ancient strength, and to observe the subtle dance of commerce, the art of fair negotiation where a man's word was his bond and his reputation his greatest treasure. In the docks, among the forest of swaying masts and the symphony of creaking rope, Pythagoras learned to read the language of weather in the shifting winds and the flight of seabirds, essential knowledge for any traveller who would dare the wine-dark sea. His hands, once soft with scholarly pursuits, grew calloused as Nicarchus showed him how the steady application of effort, whether in tilling their small plot of land for sustenance or repairing a cartwheel with proper joinery, brought its own quiet satisfaction and taught lessons no book could convey. "The cosmos has its grand design, Pythagoras," Nicarchus would say, his voice roughened by years of workshop dust, as they worked together in the small forge he had built behind their dwelling. "But a man must also learn the integrity of a well-made joint and the honesty of a day's labor. Harmony resides in both the celestial spheres and the humble anvil. The same proportions that govern the dance of planets can be found in the curve of a properly tempered blade." As if to demonstrate, he would hold up a piece they had crafted together, its lines pleasing to the eye in ways that spoke to something deeper than mere function. Pythes, her spirit a calm flame reflecting the ancient wisdom of her Delphic ancestry, tended to the shaping of his inner world with the same care a gardener might tend rare orchids. She introduced him to the soul-stirring verses of the lyric poets. In the evenings, as the oil lamps cast warm circles of light in their modest dwelling, they would discuss the varied customs of the Hellenic city-states, the strengths and follies of different forms of governance, and the ethical dilemmas that confronted men of conscience in an age where might too often made right. A keen intellect, untempered by empathy and grace, can become a harsh instrument, my son, she would counsel, her voice melodious as a perfectly tuned lyre, while her fingers worked at her weaving, an art she practised not from necessity but as a meditation, each thread placed with the same reverence a priest might offer incense. True wisdom speaks not only through irrefutable logic, but also through compassionate understanding and the quiet dignity of a life well lived. The greatest truths must be worn like fine garments, with elegance and humility, lest they become burdens that bow the soul rather than wings that lift it toward the divine. Through her patient teaching, Pythagoras learned the art of thoughtful discourse, discovering that listening was often more valuable than speaking, that questions could illuminate more than answers, and that the subtle music of well-chosen words could build bridges between minds that seemed as distant as stars. He learned, too, the delicate art of reading the unspoken language of the human heart, the slight tightening around the eyes that betrayed hidden sorrow, the particular quality of silence that preceded profound revelation, the way truth could sometimes be conveyed more clearly through a meaningful pause than through elaborate explanation. In this pastoral interlude, amidst the silver-green shimmer of olive groves and the rhythmic sigh of the Attic breeze that carried the scent of wild herbs and distant sea, Pythagoras encountered a different kind of enchantment, a melody simpler and more earth-bound than the cosmic harmonies that usually claimed his thoughts. Her name was Theano, daughter of Cleomenes, a local potter whose vessels were renowned throughout Attica for their perfect proportions and subtle glazes that captured the very essence of earth and fire. Theano possessed a quiet grace that seemed to flow from some inner spring of serenity. Her hands, though often clay-stained from working alongside her father, moved with a dancer's precision, whether shaping wet clay into forms of unassuming elegance or preparing the simple meals they shared in the vine-covered courtyard of her family's modest home. Her laughter was as clear and refreshing as water from a mountain spring, unmarked by the sophisticated irony that characterized so much discourse in the greater cities. When she looked at Pythagoras, her dark eyes reflected not the mysteries of the universe, but something equally precious, the gentle warmth of the hearth, the steadfast loyalty of a pure heart, and a love that asked nothing more complicated than his presence and affection in return. To Pythagoras, weary of grand destinies and the weight of unseen worlds pressing constantly upon his consciousness, Theano offered a haven of sweet ordinariness that felt like cool shade after walking too long under a blazing sun. He found profound solace in her uncomplicated affection, in the shared meals under the trellis where grapevines heavy with fruit created a green canopy that filtered the sunlight into patterns of dancing gold. Their conversations were of simple things, the progress of the olive harvest, the behavior of her father's cat, who had adopted a litter of abandoned kittens, the stories the traveling merchants brought from distant cities, the small domestic dreams that had nothing to do with the transmigration of souls or the numerical structure of reality. In her arms, beneath the star-scattered dome of the Attic night, he discovered a different kind of ecstasy, one rooted not in mystical revelation, but in the profound mystery of two souls recognizing their kinship across the vast loneliness of mortal existence. For the first time since childhood, the future seemed not a burden to be borne, but a gift to be unwrapped slowly, day by precious day. The pronouncements of the Pythia, which had once seemed to burn like brands in his memory, now receded to a dim whisper. The Eleusinian visions, so recently vivid and commanding, softened into something that might have been merely dreams of an overwrought imagination. For a precious season that lasted nearly a full turning of the wheel of time, the pull of his distant, unknown fate seemed no more substantial than the echo of thunder from a storm that had already passed beyond the horizon. He was perilously close to contentment, to choosing the sunlit path of mortal love and simple continuity over the arduous ascent towards a destiny he barely understood and was beginning to question. When Theano spoke shyly of the children they might have, of the home they could build together, of growing old in the peaceful rhythm of the seasons, these visions seemed not merely possible, but infinitely preferable to the cryptic challenges that had previously defined his sense of purpose. The universe, it seemed, could wait. Perhaps it had been waiting all along for him to discover that the greatest wisdom lay not in transcending the human condition, but in embracing it fully, with all its beautiful limitations and mortal sweetness. But the threads of destiny, woven by subtler hands than those of mortal desire, are not so easily broken. Like a song that continues to play in a distant room even when one tries not to listen, the call of his greater purpose never entirely ceased its soft but insistent melody. Part 2. The Summons and the Reluctant Departure. As the seasons turned and the time of the 58th Olympiad drew near, casting its long shadow of anticipation across the Hellenic world, Nicephorus and Pythes began to speak, with gentle but increasing persistence, of Delphi and the oracle's unfulfilled prophecy. At first, these conversations came as mere glancing references, easily deflected or politely ignored. But gradually they took on a more urgent quality, like the insistent knocking at a door that will not be dismissed. The oracle's words, Pythagoras, Pythes reminded him one evening, as they sat together on the small terrace of their dwelling, while the sky bled violet and gold over the distant mountains, and the first evening stars appeared like pinpricks of silver fire in the deepening dome of heaven. They spoke of your fate awaiting you at the Olympic Games, where strength meets grace. Such guidance is not given lightly by the Pythia, nor does Apollo speak in riddles merely to amuse himself. What that phrase means, only the far-shooter truly knows, but such prophecy is not given to be ignored. Pythagoras felt a familiar disquiet stir within him, like sediment disturbed in the bottom of a still pool. Theano's love was indeed a warm cloak against the chill winds of destiny, but it could not entirely muffle the resonant call that had sounded in the depths of his being since childhood, that persistent note that seemed to emanate from the very structure of reality itself, demanding acknowledgment and response. Nicephorus, with the practical wisdom of one who had spent a lifetime working with resistant materials, approached the matter from a different angle. "Consider, young man," he said one morning as they worked together in his small forge, the ring of hammer on anvil providing a rhythmic counterpoint to his words, that perhaps this Olympic journey is not meant to tear you from happiness, but to complete it. The mysteries of Eleusis were but one chamber in the great temple of knowledge. Pherecydes taught you to question, Delphi gave you direction, Eleusis showed you the unity that underlies apparent diversity. But a building requires a capstone to be complete. The metaphor resonated powerfully with Pythagoras, trained as he was to see the underlying patterns that connected seemingly disparate phenomena. A sense of unfinished purpose, a feeling that the Eleusinian initiation had been profound but somehow incomplete, not a destination but a way station, began to tug at his soul with increasing insistence. The matter came to a head during the festival of Dionysus, when the gods' sacred drama was performed in the small amphitheatre carved into the hillside above their hamlet. As Pythagoras watched the familiar story unfold, the dismemberment and resurrection of the divine child, the eternal cycle of death and rebirth that lay at the heart of the mystery religions, he felt a sudden, overwhelming clarity. The peace he had found with Theano was real, precious, and deeply nourishing to his soul. But it was the peace of winter, the necessary dormancy before spring's awakening. To remain would be to choose a kind of spiritual death, a deliberate turning away from the very forces that had shaped him from birth. That night, walking alone through the olive groves under a moon nearly full, he made his decision. When he returned to their dwelling, his face carried a gravity that made further discussion unnecessary. Nicarchus and Pythes saw immediately that the long internal struggle had resolved itself, that their beloved ward had remembered himself and his true calling. The conversation with Theano was perhaps the most difficult of his young life. She had suspected, with the intuitive wisdom of a woman in love, that this day would come. Yet knowing and accepting are different kinds of knowledge, and her tears fell like summer rain as he explained, with all the gentleness he could summon, why he must leave. "I have felt it too," she whispered, her face pale in the lamplight of her father's workshop, surrounded by the half-finished vessels that seemed to watch their parting with earthen sympathy. "In your sleep, you speak words I do not understand, in languages that perhaps do not exist in any mortal land. And sometimes, when you think I am not watching, your eyes hold a distance that makes me feel as though you are already journeying toward horizons I cannot see." With a heart that felt as though it might break from the weight of what he was choosing to sacrifice, yet quickened by the resurgence of that old, familiar yearning that was stronger than personal desire, Pythagoras consented to the Olympic journey. Theano, her eyes mirroring the impending sorrow of parting yet touched also with a kind of tragic nobility, extracted a promise of return, a promise Pythagoras gave with a sincerity that could not foresee the irrevocable transformation the journey would bring, nor how completely it would remake the very foundations of his being. "If the gods will it," he said, taking her clay-stained hands in his own, "I will return to you, but I cannot promise to return unchanged. The path I must walk may transform me beyond recognition." She nodded, her wisdom deeper than her years. "Then I will love whoever you become, even if he is a stranger wearing the face I know so well." Part 3. Olympia. The convergence of heroes and the sage's arrival. The journey south to Olympia was itself a kind of pilgrimage, each step taking Pythagoras further from the quiet domesticity he was leaving behind and closer to whatever destiny awaited him in the sacred precinct of Zeus. They travelled in a small party, Nicarchus, Pythes, Pythagoras, and 2 servants, joining the great river of humanity that flowed toward the Olympic sanctuary from every corner of the Hellenic world. The roads were filled with an extraordinary diversity of travellers, athletes whose oiled bodies gleamed like bronze statues come to life, their servants carrying the specialized equipment of their various disciplines, philosophers and poets hoping to gain fame by reciting their works to the gathered crowds, merchants with heavily laden carts full of goods from distant lands, pilgrims carrying offerings for the gods, and common citizens who had saved for years to witness the greatest spectacle in the Greek world. As they approached the sacred valley of Olympia, the very air seemed to thicken with anticipation and the accumulated power of centuries of devotion. The sight that greeted them upon arrival was overwhelming, a vast tent city spreading out from the formal boundaries of the sanctuary, a temporary metropolis that housed tens of thousands of visitors in structures ranging from the elaborate silk pavilions of wealthy city-states to simple lean-tos constructed by farmers who had walked hundreds of miles to witness the games. The arrival at Olympia proper was an immersion into a maelstrom of vibrant, raw humanity that struck the senses like a physical blow. The air itself was a thick, intoxicating brew, a heady concoction of sacrificial smoke from the perpetually burning altar of Hestia that sent columns of aromatic vapor toward the cloudless sky, the metallic tang of sweat from athletes training under the relentless Peloponnesian sun, the sweet cloy of spilled wine and honey cakes from the vendors' stalls, the rich aroma of roasting meat from 1,000 cooking fires, and the green perfume of crushed herbs and flowers carpeting the walkways where the endless procession of feet had ground them into the earth. The sounds created a deafening symphony that seemed to embody the very essence of Hellenic civilization at its most vital and chaotic. The thunderous roar of spectators already gathered in the stadium to watch the practice sessions, their voices rising and falling like ocean waves as they acclaimed local heroes and debated the merits of various competitors. The rhythmic percussion of runners' feet on the packed earth of the practice tracks, a sound like distant war drums, the explosive grunts, and slapping of flesh as wrestlers grappled in the palestra, the high-pitched, musical calls of vendors hawking everything from lucky amulets blessed by famous oracles to wine skins filled with vintages from every island in the Aegean, the babble of disparate Greek dialects from every corner of the sea-flung Hellenic world, each accent carrying the distinctive music of its homeland, and threading through it all, the haunting strains of aulos and lyre accompanying the recitations of poets who hoped to achieve immortality through the perfection of their verses. The visual spectacle was equally overwhelming. Imposing Doric temples and treasuries, their marble surfaces gleaming like bleached bone under the fierce Mediterranean light, stood sentinel over the sacred altar's grove, their sculpted pediments recounting in stone the eternal tales of gods and primordial heroes, Zeus battling the Titans, Apollo's victory over the Python, Heracles completing his mighty labors. Between these monuments moved a constant stream of humanity in all its glorious variety, athletes whose bodies represented the very peak of human physical development, their muscles sculpted by years of training into forms that seemed to blur the line between mortal flesh and divine marble, priests in their ceremonial robes carrying out the countless rituals required to maintain the favor of the gods, philosophers in their simple garments engaged in animated discussions under whatever shade they could find, and spectators from every walk of life, their faces bright with the particular joy that comes from being part of something larger than oneself. Yet even in this kaleidoscope of heroic effort and festive abandon, where the very air seemed to vibrate with human achievement and divine presence, a different kind of current began to flow, a ripple of awe and anticipation that seemed to spread through the crowds with supernatural speed, carrying a weight that distinguished it from the ordinary excitements of athletic competition. "He comes!" The announcement, first whispered among small groups of philosophers and scholars, then spoken with growing excitement by citizens who recognized the significance of the name, seemed to create a wave of stillness that moved through the surrounding chaos like wind across grain. Thales of Miletus graces Olympia with his presence. Athletes paused in their exercises, their oiled muscles suddenly motionless as statues. Priests looked up from their ritual preparations, their faces showing the particular reverence reserved for those touched by divine favor. Merchants momentarily forgot their transactions, and philosophers, gathered in earnest groups beneath the shade of olive and plane trees, fell into an expectant silence, their conversations suspended as all attention turned toward the main entrance of the sacred precinct. Part 4. The living legend Thales appears. And then he appeared, borne aloft on a simple but dignified litter of polished wood inlaid with silver, carried by 6 strong but reverent attendants who moved with the careful solemnity of those bearing sacred relics. The sight of Thales of Miletus struck the assembled multitude like a physical presence, a living embodiment of the intellectual revolution that had transformed the Hellenic understanding of the world. Thales was, as the whispered reports had proclaimed, impossibly ancient, his mortal frame having survived for more than 80 summers, an age so advanced that many regarded his continued existence as itself a kind of miracle, a testament to the life-preserving power of pure thought. His head, completely bald and polished by age to an almost luminous smoothness, was fringed by a sparse halo of hair as white and fine as spider silk. The dome of his skull, prominent and noble, seemed to glow with an inner light, as if the intensity of his contemplations had worn the bone thin and allowed the radiance of his mind to shine through. His skin, drawn taut over a frame that seemed to consist more of spirit than flesh, bore the colour and texture of ancient papyrus, marked here and there with the brown spots that come to those who have witnessed many seasons. Yet for all his obvious frailty, there was something indestructible about him, as if the essential core of his being had achieved a kind of crystalline permanence that transcended the usual limitations of mortal existence. His robe, woven from the finest Milesian wool in the traditional dark blue that marked him as an Ionian philosopher, hung loosely upon his diminished frame, its rich fabric serving to emphasize rather than conceal his ethereal thinness. His hands, resting motionless upon the linen coverlet that had been drawn up to his waist against the possibility of chill despite the day's warmth, were marvels of delicate bone and translucent skin through which the blue traces of veins could be clearly seen. Hands that had once traced geometric figures in sand, manipulated the instruments of astronomical observation, and written the first philosophical treatises in the history of human thought. For the most part, his eyes remained closed, shielded by lids as thin and delicate as the wings of moths, as if the sheer sensory intensity of the world, this riot of colour and sound and movement that was Olympia in full celebration, had become an overwhelming burden for a consciousness that had grown accustomed to communion with eternal principles. Yet when those ancient eyelids occasionally fluttered open, they revealed irises of a startling pale grey, despite extreme age, yet still capable of a disconcerting, penetrating lucidity that seemed to look not merely at objects, but through them to their essential nature. The reverential silence that followed his litter was like nothing else at the games. The usually irreverent Olympic crowds, accustomed to treating even the greatest heroes with boisterous familiarity, parted before his procession with a spontaneous reverence that seemed to arise from some instinctive recognition of genuine greatness. Children stopped their play to stare with wide eyes. Hardened soldiers removed their helmets. Even the vendors ceased their cries, as if in the presence of something too sacred for commercial considerations. This was, as every educated person in the assembly knew, almost certainly his final pilgrimage, a last desire to witness the convergence of Hellenic strength and spirit, to see once more the glorious flowering of the civilization his own intellectual courage had helped to create, before he himself returned to whatever elements had given him birth. The knowledge that they were witnessing the end of an era, the final earthly appearance of the man who had essentially invented the very concept of philosophy, lent a poignant gravity to the moment that transcended the usual festive atmosphere of the games. Part 5. The Recognition, a Legacy Proclaimed. Pythagoras, standing with Nicarchus and Pythes near the great stoa that lined the sacred way, felt the news of Thales's arrival like a physical shock, a resonance that seemed to vibrate through the very foundations of his being. This was not merely meeting a celebrity or even a great teacher. This was encountering the source, the fountainhead from which the entire stream of rational inquiry had flowed. The name of Thales had been woven through his education like a golden thread, illuminating his earliest studies in Samos, echoing in the mathematical speculations of Pherecydes, underlying every attempt to understand the world through reason rather than mere superstition. To see him now, in the flesh however frail, was akin to witnessing a myth step down from the realm of legend into the world of mortal experience. The sight of that ancient, noble head, the hands that had first dared to measure the immeasurable, the eyes that had gazed upon geometric truths as yet undreamt by other minds, it was as if the very spirit of human intellectual achievement had taken visible form. An almost irresistible compulsion drew Pythagoras forward, his entire being focused with laser-like intensity on the slowly moving procession. His guardians, sensing the profound shift in him, the sudden transformation from conflicted young man to dedicated seeker, moved with him through the crowd, navigating carefully through the assembly that trailed Thales's litter like pilgrims following a shrine. As they drew nearer to the procession, the air around them became alive with fragments of the great man's legend, spoken in hushed but animated tones by spectators who felt themselves privileged to witness this historic moment. The voices seemed to merge into a kind of living testimony, a chorus of admiration that painted Thales's achievements in words as vivid as any sculptured monument. "Behold Thales of Miletus, child of the wine-dark Aegean," proclaimed an elderly fisherman from the Ionian coast, his weathered face bright with regional pride as he gestured toward the litter. His voice, carrying the distinctive accent of the Eastern Islands, trembled with emotion. He it was who first dared to proclaim that all things, this solid earth beneath our feet, the wheeling stars above, even our own flesh and blood, spring from a single fundamental essence. Water, he named it, the arche, the first principle, the mother and father of all existence. No longer need we children of Hellas bow before 1,000 capricious deities to explain the world's mysteries, for Thales showed us that one divine substance underlies all apparent diversity. A gruff Spartan hoplite, his bronze-muscled body scarred by countless battles and his red cloak marking him as one of the elite Perioeci, nodded with the slow deliberation of one unaccustomed to intellectual speculation but capable of recognizing greatness when he encountered it. Aye, and he understood the earth itself with the clarity of a general reading terrain before battle, the warrior added, his laconic speech investing each word with additional weight. Where our fathers saw only the wrath of the earth-shaker when the ground trembled beneath their feet, Thales perceived natural law, the very foundation of our world resting upon vast waters, and when those subterranean seas shift and stir, the lands above shake in response. No mere divine caprice, but cause following cause in eternal order. A meticulously robed scholar, his pale complexion and soft hands marking him as one of the learned class from Alexandria, gestured with the animated enthusiasm of one consumed by intellectual passion. His accent carried the cosmopolitan flavor of the great Egyptian port, where the wisdom of many nations mingled and cross-fertilized. And yet his genius burned brightest in the realm of pure geometry, the Alexandrian declared, his voice rising with excitement. The tales of his geometric mastery have become legend throughout the civilized world. When he journeyed to the sacred land of Egypt, he astounded the ancient priests, men whose knowledge was already old when Troy was young, by measuring the height of the great pyramid of Khufu using nothing but shadow and reason. "Tell them how he did it," called out an interested voice from the gathering crowd. The scholar's face lit up with the joy of one given opportunity to expound upon a beloved subject. Simplicity itself, yet requiring a leap of understanding that had eluded the wisest men of Egypt for centuries. He waited until that precise moment when the shadow cast by his own staff equaled the staff's height, when the sun's angle made every object and its shadow equal in length. At that exact instant, he declared the pyramid's shadow to be its true height, a demonstration of similar triangles that left the Egyptian priests prostrate with amazement. "Indeed, a master of line and angle beyond all who came before," exclaimed a master mason from Corinth, his powerful hands unconsciously miming the familiar motions of measurement and calculation that were his daily craft. "Every man who works with stone or wood owes debt to Thales." He proved beyond all doubt that an angle inscribed within a semicircle must always be a perfect right angle, knowledge that makes possible every arch and column that graces our temples. He demonstrated that a circle is perfectly bisected by its diameter, and showed that the angles at the base of an isosceles triangle are forever equal. He gave us mathematical certainty in a world of shifting appearances. A weather-beaten navigator, his skin burnished dark by years under the Mediterranean sun, and his eyes holding the particular alertness of one whose life depended on reading the subtle signs of sea and sky, pointed toward the northern horizon, though the blazing sun made such precision meaningless. Yet even the heavens themselves yielded their secrets to his penetrating mind, the seaman declared with the fervor of one whose professional survival had benefited from Thales's discoveries. Before his time, sailors navigated by the Great Bear, Ursa Major, whose wheel is broad and obvious but imprecise in its guidance. Thales identified the little bear, Ursa Minor, as a far more constant pole star, giving us surer navigation than our fathers ever dreamed possible. "And the very rhythm of time itself," added an elderly priest from a Delphic delegation, his robes embroidered with laurel leaves that marked his sacred office. Thales calculated the solstices and equinoxes with unprecedented accuracy, marking the true rhythm of the seasons. He understood the celestial dance of the Pleiades, whose rising signals the time for sailing, and the rainy Hyades, whose appearance warns of storms to come. The agricultural calendar by which we plant and harvest, the religious festivals by which we honor the gods, all rest upon foundations he established. The priest's voice dropped to an awed whisper that somehow carried clearly through the surrounding crowd. Every teller of histories bears witness to the most astounding demonstration of his prophetic knowledge. Thales foretold the very day when the sun would be devoured by shadow, a total eclipse that fell during the height of a mighty battle between the Lydian king Aliats and Cyaxares the Mede. When the armies saw the sun die at the precise moment Thales had prophesied, terror seized both forces. The warring kings, witnessing such cosmic power wielded by mortal understanding, ceased their strife and forged immediate peace. So awed were they by this demonstration of truth revealed through pure reason. Even a shrewd merchant from Chios, still counting coins from a recent transaction, paused in his calculations to add his testimony, though his voice carried the particular tone of one who appreciated any form of profitable wisdom. Nor was the great Thales a man lost in clouds of abstract thought, impractical and removed from worldly concerns, the trader declared with grudging respect. Aristotle himself recounts how our philosopher, using his deep understanding of weather patterns and agricultural cycles, anticipated a magnificent olive harvest when all others expected merely average yields. During the winter months, when the olive presses stood idle and worthless, he quietly secured options on every press in Miletus and the surrounding territories for a pittance. The merchant's weathered face creased into an appreciative grin. When the bumper crop arrived exactly as he had calculated, and demand for pressing facilities soared beyond all expectation, he rented them out at premium prices, earning more gold in a single season than most men see in a lifetime. Thus he proved that a philosopher's mind, when applied to practical matters with the same rigor brought to celestial speculation, could yield earthly treasures as readily as intellectual ones. Part 6. The Sacred Encounter. Seeker before Sage. Pythagoras absorbed each recounted deed, each testament to Thales's revolutionary intellect, with the intensity of one who recognizes in another's achievements the blueprint for his own destiny. This was far more than mere hero worship or the casual admiration of a student for a distant master. This was the recognition of a kindred spirit across the vast gulf of generations, a pioneer who had, with audacious courage and unflinching determination, sought to understand the cosmos through the unwavering light of reason and empirical observation, rather than accepting the world as merely the capricious playground of inscrutable and unpredictable gods. Every story reinforced Pythagoras's growing conviction that he stood at the threshold of a momentous encounter, that all the seemingly random threads of his life, his early mathematical gifts, his mystical initiations, his philosophical training, even his reluctant departure from Theono's arms, had been woven together by invisible hands to bring him to this precise moment in time and space. Thales's attendants, moving with practised care, positioned his litter in the dappled shade of an ancient wild olive tree within the sacred altar's precinct. The tree itself seemed symbolically perfect, gnarled and twisted by centuries of Mediterranean storms, yet still producing the silver-green leaves and small, bitter fruit that had sustained Greek civilization since the dawn of memory. Its presence suggested the marriage of endurance and fruitfulness, of wisdom tested by time, yet still capable of nourishing new life. The sage was offered refreshment, a small cup of wine mixed with cool spring water in the proper proportion, honey cakes prepared according to ancient recipe, fresh figs that had been blessed at the altar of Demeter. But he barely acknowledged these offerings. His attention turned entirely inward, his energy seemingly reserved for the monumental effort required simply to maintain his tenuous grip on mortal existence. Every breath appeared to be a conscious choice, every heartbeat a deliberate act of will refusing to surrender to the dissolution that waited so close at hand. A natural perimeter of reverent silence formed around the litter, an invisible but palpable boundary that the usually boisterous Olympic crowds instinctively respected. The constant background noise of the games, the shouting of spectators, the calls of vendors, the laughter of children, seemed to recede, creating an island of contemplative quiet in the midst of humanity's greatest celebration. Those who had followed the procession arranged themselves in a loose circle, maintaining respectful distance while remaining close enough to witness whatever words or wisdom the dying philosopher might choose to share with the world. In this charged atmosphere, where the very air seemed to hum with anticipation and reverence, Pythagoras felt an inner transformation as sudden and complete as lightning splitting the summer sky. The vague uncertainties that had plagued him since leaving Attica, the lingering doubts about abandoning Theono's love, the persistent questions about his true calling, all of these dissolved in an instant of perfect clarity. The perplexing prophecy of the oracle concerning Olympia, which had once seemed an obscure riddle wrapped in divine mystery, now revealed its luminous purpose with crystalline precision. This was the reason. This encounter was the fate that awaited him where strength meets grace, not in the athletic competitions that surrounded them, but in this moment where the strength of pure intellect met the grace of wisdom, sophistication. He exchanged a silent glance with Nicarchus, whose weathered face showed a profound understanding born of decades spent recognizing the decisive moments when raw material transformed into something precious and enduring. The old craftsman's eyes held a mixture of pride and sorrowful recognition, pride in the young man he had helped shape, sorrow at the knowledge that this moment marked the end of their shared journey. Pythes, her face luminous with the particular wisdom that came from her Delphic heritage, offered a gentle nod of encouragement that seemed to carry the blessing of Apollo himself. In that suspended moment, Pythagoras was no longer their ward, no longer even merely their beloved companion, but a seeker stepping decisively onto the stage of his own destiny. The transformation was visible to all who watched. The uncertain youth who had arrived that morning was gone, replaced by a young man whose bearing carried the quiet authority of one who had found his true purpose. Part 7. The Approach. Courage before Wisdom. With a composure that felt simultaneously newly forged and anciently familiar, as if he were remembering rather than discovering his true nature, Pythagoras began to move forward. The throng of spectators, sensing the focused intensity that now radiated from him like heat from a forge, parted instinctively before his approach. Their murmurs died into expectant silence as they recognized that they were witnessing not merely another curious visitor, but something far more significant, a moment when destiny declares itself and claims its chosen vessel. He walked with deliberate grace, each step measured and purposeful, his bare feet sending up small puffs of the sacred Olympic dust that had been trodden by heroes and champions for centuries. The bronze sun blazed overhead, but he felt no discomfort, no awareness of anything beyond the growing presence of the ancient figure who lay beneath the olive tree's protective shade. The vibrant, clamorous world of the Olympic Games seemed to recede into a distant background, becoming no more substantial than the memory of a dream, as his entire consciousness focused on the approaching encounter. As he drew near, details that had been invisible from a distance became startlingly clear. He could see the almost translucent quality of Thales's skin, stretched taut over bones that seemed to have achieved the delicate strength of worked ivory. The philosopher's breathing was shallow but steady, each inhalation a small victory over the forces of dissolution. His hands, folded peacefully upon the linen coverlet, bore the faint stains of a lifetime spent with stylus and papyrus, the honorable marks of one who had devoted his existence to the pursuit and recording of truth. Most remarkably, despite his obvious physical frailty, there emanated from Thales a sense of profound peace, as if he had achieved a perfect harmony between his mortal limitations and his immortal understanding. He seemed not so much dying as transitioning, not departing from life, but preparing to merge with the eternal principles he had spent his existence contemplating. When Pythagoras reached the edge of the sacred space that surrounded the litter, he paused, suddenly aware of the magnitude of what he was about to attempt. Here lay not merely a famous philosopher, but the architect of an entire way of thinking, the man who had single-handedly transformed humanity's relationship with the cosmos. What right did he, a youth barely past his 16th year, have to approach such greatness? What could he possibly say that would be worthy of this moment? Yet even as these doubts flickered through his mind, a deeper certainty rose to meet them. This encounter had been foretold by the Pythia herself, blessed by the gods, and prepared for through years of rigorous training and mystical initiation. He was here not by accident but by design, not as a presumptuous youth, but as destiny's appointed vessel. The same force that had guided him through the labyrinth of Eleusis, that had spoken through the oracle's lips, that had shaped every crucial moment of his life, now propelled him forward. taking a deep breath that seemed to draw into his lungs not merely air but the very essence of the sacred grove. Pythagoras stepped across the invisible threshold and entered the circle of silence that surrounded the dying sage. Part 8. The Question. Soul speaks to soul. Kneeling slowly with profound reverence, Pythagoras felt the packed earth of the altars cool beneath his knees, each grain of dust seeming to carry the accumulated prayers and aspirations of countless pilgrims who had sought divine favor in this holiest of precincts. For what felt like an immeasurable span of time, moments that stretched into eternity, he simply remained in respectful silence, allowing himself to absorb the almost tangible aura of wisdom that emanated from the frail figure before him. The proximity to such concentrated intellectual power was overwhelming. It was as if he knelt before not merely a man, but a living embodiment of human reason itself, a consciousness that had bridged the gap between mortal limitation and cosmic understanding through pure force of contemplative will. The very air around Thales seemed charged with significance, heavy with the weight of discoveries that had fundamentally altered humanity's place in the universe. Gradually, as if summoned by the intensity of Pythagoras's attention, Thales's ancient eyelids began to flutter. Slowly, with obvious effort, they opened to reveal those startling pale grey eyes, still capable of a penetrating lucidity that seemed to look not merely at Pythagoras, but through him to the very essence of his being. For a moment that felt suspended outside the normal flow of time, the aged philosopher studied the young seeker kneeling before him, and in that exchange of gazes something passed between them, a recognition, an acknowledgment, a wordless understanding that transcended the vast difference in their years and experience. When Pythagoras finally spoke, his voice emerged clear and strong despite the profound emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. The words seemed to arise not from conscious thought, but from some deeper source within him, shaped by years of seeking and tempered by the fire of genuine longing. "Master Thales," he began, his voice carrying the distinctive cadence of one who had been trained in the arts of formal discourse yet spoke now from the depths of authentic feeling, "I am Pythagoras of Samos, son of Nisakas the gem-cutter, ward of noble Pythes who carries the blood of Delphi's oracles. I have journeyed far across the wine-dark sea and through the sacred mysteries of our people, ever in pursuit of that which underpins the apparent chaos of existence." He paused, gathering the courage to continue, aware that he was addressing not merely a famous teacher, but the very fountainhead of rational inquiry. "Your name, your deeds, your luminous reason, have been as distant stars guiding my own fumbling efforts since first I learned to trace geometric figures in the sand of my island home. Through the teachings of Pherecydes, through the revelations of the Eleusinian mysteries, through every moment of study and contemplation, your influence has shaped my understanding like water shaping stone through patient persistence." The olive tree above them stirred in a breeze that seemed to carry the very breath of the gods, causing patterns of light and shadow to dance across the philosopher's ancient face. Pythagoras felt as though he stood at the confluence of rivers. All the streams of learning and experience that had brought him to this moment were converging into a single, powerful current that would carry him toward his ultimate destiny. "Now, in your revered presence," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I beseech you with all the humility my young heart can summon, what was the heart of your understanding? What single truth, if any, illuminated for you the path through the labyrinth of appearances to the reality that lies beneath? What counsel can you offer to one who yearns, with every fibre of his soul, to grasp the true harmony of the cosmos, and to serve as a faithful vessel for whatever wisdom the gods may choose to reveal through mortal understanding?" The question hung in the air between them like incense ascending to heaven, carrying with it not merely intellectual curiosity, but the passionate hunger of a soul that had tasted the possibility of ultimate truth and could no longer be satisfied with anything less. Part 9. The Transmission, Wisdom's Final Gift. A profound silence settled over the sacred grove, so complete and absolute that the very insects seemed to pause in their eternal labors, as if all of nature recognized the gravity of the moment and held its breath in reverent anticipation. The distant sounds of the Olympic Games, the roar of crowds, the clash of athletic competition, the thousand voices of human celebration, faded to nothing more than the faint whisper of wind through distant leaves. Thales's eyes seemed to focus with an intensity that belied his physical frailty, and for a moment the accumulated wisdom of 8 decades blazed forth with startling clarity. He gazed at Pythagoras not with the vague benevolence of extreme age, but with the sharp assessment of a master craftsman examining raw material to determine its potential for transformation into something precious and enduring. What he saw in the young man's face, the evidence of genuine seeking, the marks of mystical initiation, the particular quality of attention that distinguished the true philosopher from the merely curious, seemed to satisfy some inner criteria. A tremor, almost imperceptible, passed through his frame, and when he spoke, his voice, though barely audible, carried the accumulated authority of a lifetime spent in communion with eternal principles. "Young seeker," Thales whispered, each word emerging with the deliberate precision of one who knows that his remaining time is measured in moments rather than years, "I perceive in you the fire that has burned in my own breast since youth first awakened me to wonder. The questions you ask are the right questions, born not of idle curiosity, but of the soul's desperate hunger for truth." He paused, his breathing shallow but steady, gathering the precious energy required for what he seemed to recognize as his final teaching. "The cosmos," he continued, his voice gaining strength as if fueled by the intensity of his conviction, "is indeed a tapestry woven with divine reason, a harmony so perfect that mortal minds can barely glimpse its true proportions. Yet glimpse it we can, and must, for in that glimpsing lies our only hope of transcending the limitations that bind us to ignorance and error." His pale eyes, for a moment, seemed to focus on something beyond the immediate scene, perhaps on visions of the mathematical perfection he had discovered in geometry, or the celestial clockwork he had perceived in the movements of stars, or the underlying unity he had intuited beneath the apparent diversity of material existence. "But if you seek the deepest wellsprings of this knowing," he said, his voice dropping to barely more than a breath, yet somehow carrying with perfect clarity to Pythagoras's straining ears, "if you would drink from the oldest streams of wisdom and learn the primordial secrets that gave birth to all subsequent understanding, then you must journey to the source from which all rivers of knowledge flow." With an effort that seemed to cost him dearly, Thales raised one trembling hand, pointing toward the southern horizon where, beyond the mountains of the Peloponnese, beyond the wine-dark Mediterranean, lay lands that had been ancient when Hellas was young. "Go south," he commanded, his voice carrying the weight of prophecy, "to the land our fathers called Chem, which men now name Egypt. There, in the shadow of monuments that were already old when our ancestors first learned to work bronze, dwell priests whose wisdom flows unbroken from the dawn of human understanding." His eyes, despite their physical cloudiness, seemed to blaze with the intensity of inner vision as he continued. "In the temples that line the sacred Nile, geometry was born from the practical necessity of measuring fields after the river's annual flood. There, the movements of stars were first mapped with precision that puts Babylonian astronomy to shame. There, the secrets of number were first discovered and preserved, the mystical relationships that bind all creation into a single, harmonious whole. The philosopher's breathing grew more labored, but his determination to complete this final transmission seemed to burn with an intensity that transcended physical limitation. The priests of Memphis and Thebes, of Heliopolis and Dendera, guard knowledge that makes our proudest achievements seem like children's games. They have calculated the precession of the equinoxes, discovered numerical relationships that reveal the very architecture of creation. He paused, his ancient frame shuddering with the effort of speech, yet his eyes remained fixed on Pythagoras with an intensity that seemed to bore into the young man's very soul. But more than geometric theorems or astronomical calculations, they possess something infinitely more precious, the wisdom of the soul's journey, the knowledge of how consciousness itself participates in the divine order that underlies all appearances. Now his voice dropped to barely more than a whisper, yet each word seemed to carry the weight of absolute conviction. Go to them, young Pythagoras. Submit yourself to their instruction with the same humility you would show to the gods themselves. Learn their language, master their arts, absorb their wisdom until it becomes as much a part of you as the blood that flows in your veins. Only then will you be prepared for the true work that awaits you, the work of synthesizing the mystical insights of the East with the rational methods of the West, creating a new form of understanding that will illuminate the path for generations yet unborn. Part 10. The Final Collapse and Sacred Charge. The supreme effort required for this extended discourse seemed to drain the last reserves of Thales's vital energy. As the final words left his lips, a profound exhaustion settled over him like a heavy cloak, and the fire that had briefly blazed in his ancient eyes began to flicker and fade. The merciless Olympian sun, despite the olive tree's protective shade, beat down with an intensity that seemed to draw the very essence of life from his fragile frame. Yet even as his physical strength ebbed away, Thales summoned one final burst of will. With tremendous effort, he extended his trembling hand toward Pythagoras, who immediately reached out to receive whatever blessing or token the dying philosopher might choose to bestow. But instead of an object, Thales placed his palm against Pythagoras's forehead, and in that moment of contact something passed between them, not merely words or ideas, but the very essence of the philosophical spirit itself, the sacred flame that had driven humanity's first steps toward rational understanding of the cosmos. "The torch," Thales whispered, his voice now so faint that Pythagoras had to lean close to catch the words, "passes from hand to hand across the generations. I received it from the Babylonian star-watchers, from the Egyptian priests, from all who came before and dared to ask the eternal questions. Now I pass it to you, and you must carry it forward, kindle new fires with its flame, and ensure that it never dies." His hand fell away, and with it seemed to go the last of his strength. A violent tremor shook his frail body, more intense than any that had come before. His breath caught in a sharp, shallow gasp, and his eyes, which had blazed with such intensity during their exchange, lost their focus and began to roll back into his head. With a sigh so faint it was almost indistinguishable from the whisper of wind through the olive branches, Thales of Miletus collapsed against the cushions of his litter, his face taking on the stark pallor that marks the boundary between life and death. A collective cry of dismay arose from his attendants, who had been waiting with practised vigilance for precisely this moment. Physicians, ever present at the Olympic Games to tend the inevitable injuries of athletic competition, rushed forward with their instruments and medicines. Cool water was brought, fans were waved to create movement in the stifling air, aromatic herbs were burned to clear the oppressive atmosphere. But it was immediately apparent to all who witnessed the scene that the fragile thread of life was not merely fraying, but had already been severed. The greatest mind of the age had chosen this moment, in the presence of his chosen successor, to release its hold on mortal existence and join the eternal conversation of the spheres. Part 11. The Transformation. Destiny Embraced. Pythagoras remained kneeling beside the litter, momentarily frozen by the suddenness and finality of what he had witnessed. In the space of a few heartbeats, he had received the greatest gift of his young life and witnessed the passing of an era. The hand that had touched his forehead still tingled with residual energy, as if the philosopher's final act had implanted something vital and transformative directly into his consciousness. Slowly, with movements that seemed weighted by the magnitude of what had just occurred, he rose from his knees. His mind reeled with the implications of Thales's final words, yet beneath the initial shock and confusion, a profound clarity was beginning to emerge. This had been no chance encounter, no fortunate accident of timing. Every element of his life, his birth under auspicious stars, his early theoretical gifts, his mystical initiations, his philosophical training, even his painful departure from Theono's embrace, had been orchestrated by invisible hands to bring him to this precise moment in time and space. The image of Thales, his eyes blazing with the fire of intellect even as his body surrendered to mortality, seared itself permanently into Pythagoras's memory. This was no mere suggestion he had received, no casual advice from a teacher to a student, but a sacred charge passed down through the generations, a divine directive that resonated with all the authority of his previous oracular encounters and mystical experiences. As the philosopher's attendants worked with desperate efficiency to create a space around their master, Pythagoras found himself surrounded by Nicarchus and Pythes, whose faces reflected both deep concern for the dying sage and profound recognition of the momentous significance of what their ward had just experienced. In their eyes, he could see reflected his own transformation. The uncertain youth who had knelt before Thales was gone, replaced by a young man whose bearing carried the unmistakable authority of divine calling. The gentle, pastoral allure of his interrupted life with Theono, which had seemed so compelling just days before, now appeared as distant and insubstantial as morning mist before the full blaze of the Mediterranean sun. That chapter of his existence, sweet and human as it had been, was now definitively closed, sealed by forces far greater than personal desire or mortal affection. The perplexing prophecy of the oracle concerning his fate at Olympia, which had once seemed an obscure riddle wrapped in divine mystery, now revealed its luminous purpose with crystalline clarity. It had been designed to bring him to this exact moment, to facilitate this sacred transmission from the patriarch of Hellenic wisdom to his chosen successor. "Egypt," Pythagoras declared, his voice emerging with a firmness that surprised even himself. The word carried the weight of absolute conviction, the unmistakable authority of one who has found his true path and will not be deterred from following it. He turned to face Nicarchus and Pythes, and in his eyes, which had so recently reflected the simple joys and conflicts of young manhood, there now blazed an unquenchable fire that spoke of destiny accepted and purpose embraced. "Thales has shown me the way forward with the clarity of a geometric proof," he continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "To Egypt I must journey, to the ancient temples where the priests guard the primordial secrets of creation itself. It is there, in that cradle of human wisdom, that the fullness of understanding awaits, not merely intellectual knowledge, but the sacred synthesis that will allow me to serve as a bridge between the mystical traditions of the East and the rational methods of our Hellenic world. Part 12. The Blessing and the New Beginning. Nicarchus, his craftsman's hands coming to rest with paternal affection on Pythagoras's shoulders, nodded with the grave understanding of one who had always known that this moment would come. His weathered face, marked by decades of patient work with precious stones and metals, showed no surprise at this declaration, only a deep satisfaction that spoke of long-held hopes finally coming to fruition. "So it shall be, Pythagoras," he said, his voice carrying the solemn weight of one who witnesses the completion of a sacred work. "Your path has always been one of extraordinary seeking, marked by encounters that transcend the ordinary boundaries of human experience. We knew that our quiet interlude in Attica was but a pause, a gathering of strength and wisdom for the greater voyages that lay ahead. The same divine force that brought you to Pherecydes, that spoke through the Pythia's lips, that guided you through the mysteries of Eleusis, has now revealed the next stage of your journey through the words of the greatest sage of our time." Pythes, her eyes shimmering with a complex mixture of maternal pride, prophetic understanding, and the inevitable sorrow that comes with any profound farewell, reached out to touch Pythagoras's cheek with infinite tenderness. When she spoke, her voice carried the ancient wisdom of her Delphic heritage, resonating with harmonies that seemed to echo the very music of the spheres. "The seed that was planted in your soul by Pherecydes the Wise," she said, her words emerging with a measured cadence of prophecy, watered by the sacred springs of Apollo's sanctuary, brought to first flowering in the profound darkness of Demeter's hall, has now received its ultimate direction from the dying breath of our world's greatest sage. The circle closes and opens simultaneously. What began as a child's wonder at the harmony of numbers now reveals itself as preparation for a sacred mission that will reshape the very foundations of human understanding. She paused, her gaze turning briefly toward the southern horizon where Egypt lay beyond the curve of the earth, then returned to focus on Pythagoras with an intensity that seemed to pierce through time itself to perceive the extraordinary destiny that awaited him. "Your true becoming awaits you in the land of the Nile, beloved son of our hearts," she continued. "There, among the monuments that were ancient when our Hellenic civilization was but a gleam in Zeus's eye, you will learn the deepest secrets of the cosmos and forge them into a new wisdom that will illuminate the path for countless generations yet unborn. Go with our blessing, carry our love as a talisman against the trials that await, and remember always that you are not merely a seeker of knowledge, but a servant of the divine harmony that binds all creation into a single, perfect whole." The news of Thales's collapse, which would within hours circulate throughout Olympia as the tidings of the great philosopher's death from the relentless heat of the games, began to cast a sombre pall over the athletic contests and festive celebrations. Crowds gathered around the sacred olive tree, their voices hushed with a particular reverence reserved for moments when legend passes into history. Yet for Pythagoras, this poignant event marked not an ending, but a transformative, sacred commencement that would define the remainder of his earthly existence. A torch, carried faithfully by the first great light of rational inquiry, had been passed to his keeping. His youth, with all its trials and illuminations, its mystical encounters and human attachments, its moments of doubt and flashes of clarity, had culminated in this decisive, heart-stopping encounter that would forever divide his life into before and after. Now the way forward, though arduous beyond imagination and immeasurably long, stretched before him with the stark clarity of a mathematical demonstration. It led south, across the wine-dark Mediterranean to the land of obelisks and sphinxes, to the temples where priests guarded secrets that were ancient when the world was young, to the very wellsprings of knowledge that Thales had revealed with his final breath. His will, which had been momentarily lulled by the sweet song of earthly affection and the comfortable rhythms of ordinary life, was now tempered like the finest steel, honed by divine purpose and fiercely dedicated to the pursuit of ultimate truth. The comfortable certainties of his Attic existence, the simple joys of human love, the familiar patterns of Hellenic life, all of these now appeared as beautiful but ultimately insignificant distractions from the great work that awaited him. He would go to Egypt. He would brave its mysteries with the courage of one who has been chosen by the gods themselves. He would absorb its ancient lore with the dedication of one who understands that he carries not merely his own destiny, but the hopes of all who would come after him. And he would strive, with every fibre of his being, to fulfill the extraordinary mission that had been so consistently, and now so definitively, revealed to him through the converging voices of oracle, mystery, and dying sage. The pursuit of divine harmony, the unwavering quest for the luminous truth that bound the cosmos into a coherent and meaningful whole, was no longer merely an intellectual passion or a philosophical inclination. It had become the sacred vow of his entire existence, the defining purpose for which he had been born and toward which every moment of his life had been invisibly directed. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sacred grove in shades of gold and amber that seemed to transform the very air into liquid light, Pythagoras stood in the shadow of the olive tree where wisdom had just passed from one generation to the next. Around him, the Olympic games continued their ancient celebration of human excellence and divine favor, but he was no longer truly part of that world. He had stepped across an invisible threshold into a realm where individual desire yielded to cosmic purpose, where personal will aligned itself with the fundamental harmony of existence itself. The boy who had first entered into a tunnel to find the other side was gone forever. In his place stood a young man touched by destiny, marked by the gods, and charged with a sacred mission that would eventually transform not merely his own understanding but the entire course of human intellectual development. Egypt awaited. The ancient wisdom called to him across the waters, and Pythagoras, newly born into his true nature and purpose, prepared to answer that call with all the courage and dedication that the divine harmony of the cosmos demanded from its chosen servants. The sacred transmission was complete. The real journey could now begin.